In the winter of 1950, deep in the frozen mountains of North Korea, 30,000 United Nations troops faced an enemy they never saw coming. 120,000 Chinese soldiers surrounded them in temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero. What followed was one of the most brutal battles in military history. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir. This was not just a fight against the enemy. This was a fight against nature itself. A fight where frostbite killed more men than bullets. A fight where Marines had to chip frozen bodies out of the ground just to use them as sandbags. A fight where survival seemed impossible. But these men refused to surrender. They refused to quit. And they refused to die. To all the veterans who fought at Chosin Reservoir, to those who survived the frozen hell, and to those who didn't make it home, we honor you. To understand what happened at Chosin Reservoir, we first need to understand how the war got to this point. In June 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea, crossing the 38th parallel with overwhelming force. The United Nations, led by the United States, responded immediately. General Douglas MacArthur commanded the UN forces. By September 1950, MacArthur had executed one of the most brilliant military maneuvers in history, the Incheon landing. This bold amphibious assault behind enemy lines cut off North Korean supply routes and turned the tide of the war. The North Korean army collapsed. UN forces pushed north, chasing the retreating enemy all the way to the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. Victory seemed certain. MacArthur promised the troops they'd be home by Christmas, but MacArthur made a critical mistake. He underestimated China. Chinese leaders had warned that if UN forces approached their border, they would intervene. MacArthur didn't believe them. He thought China was bluffing. He was wrong. In late October 1950, Chinese forces began secretly crossing the Yalu River under cover of darkness. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the People's Volunteer Army, the PVA, moved into North Korea. They traveled at night, hid during the day, and avoided detection by American reconnaissance planes. By November, over 300,000 Chinese troops were in North Korea, and the Americans had no idea. The UN forces were scattered across a massive front, stretched thin and vulnerable. The stage was set for disaster. In late November 1950, the 1st Marine Division, along with Army units from the 7th Infantry Division, were advancing north toward the Yalu River. Their route took them through some of the most brutal terrain in Korea, the Taebaek Mountains. At the center of this region was the Chosin Reservoir, a frozen body of water surrounded by steep, snow-covered mountains. The temperature was already dropping fast. By late November, it would regularly hit 20 to 30 degrees below zero. At night, it could drop to 40 below. This was the coldest weather most of these men had ever experienced. The Marines were organized into 3 main positions. At the northern end of the reservoir, at a village called Udam-Ni, were the 5th Marines and the 7th Marines, about 8,000 men. 14 miles south, at Hagaruri, was a critical supply base with about 3,000 support troops, engineers, and rear echelon personnel. Another 11 miles south of that, at Koto-Ri, was the 1st Marine Regiment. On the eastern side of the reservoir was a smaller army force, Regimental Combat Team 31, later known as Task Force McLean, and eventually Task Force Faith. This force had about 3,200 soldiers from the 7th Infantry Division. The plan was simple: push north, reach the Yalu River, end the war. But the Chinese had other plans. On the night of November 27th, 1950, as the Marines settled into their positions, the Chinese struck. Out of the darkness, out of the frozen mountains, came wave after wave of enemy soldiers. Bugles blared, whistles shrieked. and the Chinese attacked with overwhelming numbers, determined to surround and destroy the entire UN force. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir had begun. November 27, 1950. The attack came without warning. At Udam-Ni, the northernmost marine position, the 5th and 7th Marines were dug in for the night. The temperature had already dropped below zero. Marines huddled in their sleeping bags, trying to stay warm. Then the bugles started. Chinese soldiers poured out of the mountains, screaming, blowing horns, and firing their weapons. They attacked in human waves, hundreds of men charging straight into Marine positions. The Marines opened fire with everything they had: machine guns, rifles, mortars, grenades. The muzzle flashes lit up the frozen night like lightning. But the Chinese kept coming. For every soldier that fell, 2 more took his place. They climbed over their own dead to reach the Marine lines. Some Marines were overrun. Others fought hand-to-hand with bayonets, entrenching tools and fists. The fighting was brutal, close, and desperate. By dawn, the Marines had held their ground, but they were surrounded. The Chinese controlled the mountains around Udam-Ni and had cut the road south. The 8,000 Marines were trapped. 14 miles south, at Hagaruri, the situation was just as dire. The supply base was defended by only 3,000 men, most of them support troops, not combat infantry. Engineers, clerks, mechanics, and cooks were handed rifles and told to hold the line. The Chinese attacked in force, trying to overrun the base. If Hagaruri fell, the Marines at Udam-Ni would have no escape route and no supplies. But the defenders refused to break. They fought with everything they had, holding off wave after wave of Chinese attackers. The fighting was so close that some Chinese soldiers made it inside the perimeter before being killed in hand-to-hand combat. By morning, Hagaruri had survived, but barely. The base was surrounded, and casualties were mounting. But the worst situation of all was on the eastern side of the reservoir, where Task Force McLean was positioned. This army unit of 3,200 men was about to face annihilation. Task Force McLean, later called Task Force Faith after its original commander was killed, was positioned on the eastern shore of the Chosin Reservoir. Unlike the Marines, these soldiers were not as well trained or experienced. Many were recent replacements, new to combat. On the night of November 27th, the Chinese hit them hard. The enemy attacked from all sides, swarming the positions with overwhelming numbers. Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith took command after Colonel McLean was killed. He tried to organize a defense, but the situation was desperate. The soldiers were scattered, low on ammunition, and freezing. By November 28th, Faith realized they had to break out or die. He ordered his men to load the wounded onto trucks and fight their way south to Hagaruri. On the afternoon of November 29th, the convoy began moving. Almost immediately, they were ambushed. Chinese soldiers fired from the hills. Mortars exploded around the trucks. Then disaster struck. A friendly napalm strike intended to hit Chinese positions accidentally landed on the convoy. 8 to 10 American soldiers were killed by their own air support. The convoy ground to a halt. Chinese soldiers swarmed the trucks, killing the wounded and setting vehicles on fire. Lieutenant Colonel Faith was shot and killed trying to rally his men. The task force collapsed into chaos. Soldiers abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot across the frozen reservoir. Many fell through the ice and drowned. Others were cut down by Chinese fire. Of the 3,200 men in Task Force Faith, only about 600 made it to Hagaruri alive. Most were wounded or suffering from severe frostbite. The destruction of Task Force Faith was one of the worst disasters for American forces in the Korean War, but the survivors who made it to Hagaruri would soon play a critical role in what came next. By November 30th, the situation was clear. The 1st Marine Division was surrounded. The Chinese had cut the road. There was no resupply, no reinforcements, no escape route. Most commanders would have surrendered. But Major General Oliver P. Smith, commander of the 1st Marine Division, was not most commanders. When asked if his men were retreating, Smith gave a response that would become legendary. "Retreat, hell." "We're not retreating. We're just advancing in another direction." Smith's plan was simple but brutal. Fight their way south, from Udam-Ni to Hagaruri, then from Hagaruri to Koto-Ri, and finally all the way to the port city of Hungnam on the coast. It was 78 miles of frozen hell. Every mile would be a fight. But Smith refused to leave anyone behind. The dead, the wounded, even the equipment, everything would come with them. On December 1st, the breakout from Udam-Ni began. The 5th and 7th Marines formed a moving column, with the wounded loaded onto trucks and jeeps. The Chinese attacked constantly. Snipers fired from the hills. Mortars exploded along the road. Ambushes hit the column from all sides. The Marines fought back with rifles, machine guns, and close air support. Marine Corsair fighters screamed overhead, dropping napalm and strafing Chinese positions. The column moved slowly, fighting for every yard. At night, the Marines stopped and formed defensive perimeters. The Chinese attacked in waves, blowing bugles and screaming. The fighting was savage. Marines fought in temperatures so cold that weapons froze. Men had to urinate on their rifles to thaw the bolts. Morphine froze solid and couldn't be used on the wounded. Blood plasma froze in the bottles. Frostbite was everywhere. Men lost fingers, toes, ears, and noses to the cold. Some Marines were found frozen to death in their sleeping bags. Others had to be thawed by fires before they could walk. But the Marines kept moving. They carried their wounded. They dragged their dead. And they fought off every Chinese attack. On December 4th, the 1st Marines from Udam-Ni reached Hagaruri. They had fought for 72 hours straight, covering just 14 miles. But they made it. The next phase of the breakout was about to begin. At Hagaruri, the Marines regrouped. The wounded were evacuated by air from a hastily built airstrip. C-47 transport planes landed on the frozen dirt runway, taking out the most critically wounded. But there were too many. Hundreds of men had severe frostbite. Others had gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and burns. The airstrip became a lifeline. Over 4,000 wounded were flown out from Hagaruri over the next several days. But not everyone could be evacuated. Thousands of Marines were still fit enough to fight, and they would need to walk out. On December 6th, the column began moving south from Hagaruri toward Koto-Ri, 11 miles away. Once again, the Chinese attacked. The road was narrow, winding through steep mountain passes. The enemy controlled the high ground, firing down on the Marines. Mortars exploded constantly. Snipers picked off stragglers. But the Marines fought back with determination. They cleared the hills one by one, using grenades, rifles, and bayonets. Close air support hammered Chinese positions. Artillery from Koto-Ri provided covering fire. The column pressed forward, slowly but steadily. At one point, the Chinese blew up a bridge along the road, creating a gap that trucks and tanks couldn't cross. Engineers were called in. Under fire, they built a temporary bridge using materials airdropped by C-119 flying boxcar planes. The Treadway Bridge, as it was called, was assembled in freezing conditions, with enemy fire all around. But it held. The column crossed and continued moving. By December 7th, the Marines reached Koto-Ri. Another leg of the journey was complete. But the hardest part was still ahead. From Koto-Ri to the coast was still over 40 miles, and the Chinese were waiting. The final stretch from Koto-Ri to Hungnam was the longest and most dangerous. The road descended from the mountains through a series of narrow valleys and choke points. The Chinese knew this was their last chance to destroy the Marines, and they attacked with everything they had. On December 8th, the column began moving south. The lead elements were hit immediately. Chinese soldiers ambushed the convoy from the hills, raking the trucks with machine gun fire. Marine infantry dismounted and stormed the ridgelines, clearing enemy positions one by one. The column moved slowly, stopping constantly to fight off attacks. At night, the Marines formed defensive perimeters and dug in. The Chinese attacked in waves, trying to overrun the positions. But the Marines held. They fought with rifles, grenades, machine guns, and sheer determination. Many Marines were so exhausted they could barely stand. Some fell asleep while firing their weapons. Others collapsed from frostbite and had to be carried. But they kept fighting. By December 10th, the lead elements of the column reached Udam-Ni, a village near the base of the mountains. From there, the road flattened out and widened. The worst was over. On December 11th, the 1st Marine Division reached the coastal city of Hungnam. They had fought for 17 days straight, covering 78 miles of frozen enemy-held territory. They had brought their wounded. They had brought their dead. They had even brought their equipment. Not a single piece of major equipment was left behind. The breakout from Chosin Reservoir was complete. But the cost was staggering. The casualties from the Battle of Chosin Reservoir were among the highest of the Korean War. For the United States and UN forces, the numbers were devastating. 1,029 killed in action. 4,582 wounded in action. 4,894 missing in action or captured. But those numbers don't tell the full story. There were also 7,338 non-battle casualties, mostly from frostbite. That means nearly half of the 30,000 men who fought at Chosin were either killed, wounded, or incapacitated by the cold. Some men lost fingers, toes, hands, and feet to frostbite. Others were blinded by the cold. Many suffered psychological trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The 1st Marine Division alone suffered around 4,400 total casualties. The survivors of Task Force Faith, the army unit on the east side of the reservoir, had it even worse. Of the 3,200 men in the task force, only about 600 survived. That's a casualty rate of over 80%. The Chinese suffered even worse. According to estimates, the People's Volunteer Army lost around 20,000 killed in action. Another 28,954 suffered non-battle casualties, mostly from frostbite. That's a total of nearly 50,000 Chinese casualties. Some Chinese units were completely wiped out. Entire regiments froze to death in the mountains while trying to ambush the Marines. Chinese soldiers wore thin cotton uniforms and had little protection from the cold. Many died from exposure before they ever fired a shot. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir was not just a battle between armies. It was a battle against nature, and nature was just as deadly as the enemy. The survivors of Chosin Reservoir called themselves the Chosin Few and the Frozen Chosen. They had survived one of the most brutal battles in history, and they wore that survival with pride. But the battle had a lasting impact on all who fought there. Many Marines suffered from frostbite for the rest of their lives. Fingers and toes that had frozen at Chosin would ache in cold weather decades later. Some men had to have limbs amputated years after the battle due to complications from frostbite. The psychological scars were just as deep. Many veterans suffered from what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about the Chinese attacks, the bugles, the screams, the cold. Some never spoke about Chosin. Others could talk about nothing else. But despite the trauma, the veterans of Chosin formed a powerful bond. They had faced death together and survived. They had depended on each other in the most desperate circumstances, and that bond never broke. The Chosin Few Association was formed to keep that bond alive, to honor the fallen, and to tell the story of what happened in the frozen mountains of North Korea. Today, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir is remembered as one of the greatest fighting retreats in military history. The 1st Marine Division was surrounded, outnumbered 4-1, fighting in the coldest weather imaginable, and they fought their way out. General O.P. Smith's leadership was critical. He refused to panic, refused to leave anyone behind, and refused to give up. His calm, methodical planning saved thousands of lives. The Marines themselves showed incredible courage. They fought when most men would have quit. They carried their wounded when most men would have left them. And they marched through hell when most men would have frozen to death. The legacy of Chosin is one of determination, sacrifice, and the unbreakable will to survive. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir was fought by multiple units, but the backbone of the defense was the 1st Marine Division. The key units involved included the 5th Marine Regiment, positioned at Udam-Ni and responsible for the initial fighting and breakout. The 7th Marine Regiment, also at Udam-Ni, fought alongside the 5th Marines in the breakout and rearguard actions. The 1st Marine Regiment, stationed at Koto-Ri, provided support and defended the southern supply route. The 11th Marine Regiment, the artillery regiment of the 1st Marine Division, provided critical fire support throughout the battle. Marine aviation units, including Marine Fighter Squadron 5 MF-214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, and VMF-312, flew close air support missions in freezing conditions. The pilots flew Corsair fighters and provided napalm strikes, strafing runs, and reconnaissance. On the Army side, the 7th Infantry Division provided Regimental Combat Team 31, later known as Task Force McLean and then Task Force Faith. This force was positioned on the east side of the reservoir and suffered the worst casualties. The 3rd Infantry Division provided some support and rear security as the Marines moved south. British Royal Marines from 41 Commando also fought at Chosin, attached to the 1st Marine Division. They fought with distinction and suffered heavy casualties. The enemy force was the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, the PVA. The main attacking units were from the 9th Army Group, commanded by General Song Shiji. The 9th Army Group consisted of over 120,000 soldiers organized into multiple divisions. The primary attacking divisions included the 20th Army, the 26th Army, and the 27th Army. These were experienced units, many of which had fought in the Chinese Civil War. The Chinese had the advantage of numbers and terrain. They knew the mountains, used the high ground for ambushes, and attacked in overwhelming human waves. But they had critical weaknesses. Their soldiers were poorly equipped for the cold. They wore thin cotton uniforms, had little food, and no medical supplies. Thousands froze to death. Their logistics were almost non-existent. The Chinese had no trucks, no air support, and no artillery support beyond what they could carry on foot. This meant they couldn't sustain long battles or replace their losses. Despite these weaknesses, the Chinese fought with incredible determination. They attacked in waves, accepting massive casualties to try to overwhelm the Marines. Their courage was undeniable, but their lack of equipment and supplies ultimately doomed their offensive. The United States and UN forces used a combination of combined arms tactics, overwhelming firepower, and disciplined leadership to survive Chosin. The Marines relied on small unit tactics, with squads and platoons acting independently to clear enemy positions. They used fire and maneuver, with one element providing covering fire while another advanced. They dug in every night, forming defensive perimeters with interlocking fields of fire. Machine guns were positioned to cover approaches, and mortar crews stood ready to fire illumination rounds and high explosives. Artillery support was critical. The 11th Marines fired thousands of rounds, breaking up Chinese attacks before they could reach Marine positions. Forward observers called in fire missions constantly, sometimes bringing artillery down within 50 yards of friendly troops. Air support was decisive. Marine Corsair fighters flew in temperatures so cold that engines froze and hydraulics failed. Pilots flew multiple missions per day, dropping napalm, firing rockets, and strafing Chinese positions. Close air support was often the difference between survival and annihilation. The Marines also used tanks and armored vehicles. M26 Pershing tanks provided mobile firepower, destroying Chinese positions and covering the withdrawal. Amphibious tractors carried wounded and supplies. The Chinese used guerrilla tactics and human wave attacks. Their strategy was to surround the Marines, cut their supply lines, and destroy them piecemeal. They attacked at night, using darkness to close the distance before opening fire. They used bugles, whistles, and horns to coordinate attacks and to terrify the enemy. The sound of Chinese bugles became one of the most feared sounds at Chosin. The Chinese also used terrain to their advantage. They occupied the high ground, setting up ambushes along the narrow roads. They dug into the hills, making them difficult to dislodge. The Chinese relied on infiltration tactics, sending small units to probe Marine defenses and find weak points. Once they found a gap, they would mass troops and attack in force. But the Chinese had critical weaknesses. Their human wave attacks resulted in massive casualties. Chinese soldiers charged into machine gun fire and were mowed down by the hundreds. Their lack of artillery and air support meant they couldn't suppress Marine positions before attacking, and their poor logistics meant they couldn't sustain prolonged battles. Many Chinese soldiers starved or froze to death before they could engage the enemy. The Marines also faced incredible challenges. The cold was the biggest enemy. Weapons froze and had to be thawed. Oil in rifles turned to sludge. Batteries died in the cold. Medical supplies froze solid. Blood plasma couldn't be used because it froze in the bottles. Morphine froze and couldn't be injected. Frostbite was rampant. Men had to check each other constantly to make sure their skin wasn't freezing. The terrain was brutal. The mountains were steep, covered in snow and ice. The roads were narrow, winding, and easily blocked. Evacuating the wounded was difficult. Helicopters were used when possible, but they were scarce and vulnerable to enemy fire. Most wounded had to be carried by truck or on foot. Despite these challenges, the Marines adapted and overcame. They improvised solutions, worked together, and refused to give up. By December 11th, 1950, the 1st Marine Division had reached the coastal city of Hungnam. They had fought for 17 days straight, covering 78 miles of enemy territory in sub-zero temperatures. The breakout from Chosin Reservoir was complete, but the battle had a lasting impact on the Korean War. From a tactical perspective, the battle was a victory for the UN forces. The Marines had been surrounded and outnumbered, but they fought their way out. They inflicted massive casualties on the Chinese, with estimates of over 50,000 enemy casualties, compared to around 17,000 UN casualties, including frostbite cases. The Chinese 9th Army Group was so badly mauled that it took months to recover. Some divisions lost over 50% of their combat strength. The battle delayed the Chinese offensive and gave UN forces time to regroup. But from a strategic perspective, the battle was part of a broader Chinese victory. The massive Chinese intervention had pushed UN forces out of North Korea. The dream of unifying Korea under a democratic government was over. The war would continue for 2 more years, eventually ending in a stalemate at the 38th parallel, roughly where it had started. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir also changed the nature of the war. It proved that China was willing to commit massive forces and accept huge casualties to prevent a UN victory. It showed that the war would not end quickly and that the cost would be much higher than anyone had expected. For the United States, Chosin became a symbol of Marine Corps toughness and determination. The phrase "Chosin Few" became legendary. The Marines had refused to surrender, refused to leave anyone behind, and fought their way out of an impossible situation. For the families of those who fought, the battle was devastating. Over 1,000 men were killed in action, and thousands more were wounded or suffered permanent injuries from frostbite. Many families would never see their loved ones again. The battle also revealed the brutality of the Korean War. Chosin was one of the coldest, deadliest, and most desperate battles in American military history. It showed that wars are not just won with firepower and tactics, but with the courage and endurance of the men on the ground. Today, the battle is remembered as one of the defining moments of the Korean War. It is studied in military academies around the world as an example of leadership, courage, and the will to survive against impossible odds. The veterans of Chosin are honored as heroes. Their determination, their sacrifice, and their refusal to quit saved thousands of lives and preserved the honor of the United States Marine Corps. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir was more than just a military engagement. It was a test of human endurance, a test of courage, a test of the will to survive when death seemed certain. For 17 days, 30,000 men fought in temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero. They fought an enemy that outnumbered them 4-1. They fought frostbite, exhaustion, and despair. Many didn't make it. Over 1,000 were killed. Thousands more were wounded. Entire units were destroyed. But those who survived became legends. They became the Chosin Few, the frozen Chosin, the men who refused to surrender, the men who carried their wounded, the men who fought their way through 78 miles of hell and lived to tell the story. To all the veterans of the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, we honor you. To those who made it home, and to those who gave their lives in the frozen mountains of North Korea, your sacrifice will never be forgotten. You faced impossible odds, and you survived. You proved that courage, determination, and the will to never give up can overcome anything. If you found this story powerful and important, please hit that like button and subscribe. Help us share the stories of these incredible men so that their legacy lives on.